Good afternoon, everyone. This is Stephanie Steiner at ASSI. I'm the Deputy Director of Assessments. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Just wanted to let you know that we are recording this session so that folks can reference it later on. If you are not speaking, I would ask that you please put yourselves on mute so that we can minimize background noise. And we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the ASSI webinar on PARCC Remote Administration Guidance. We're very happy that you've joined us this afternoon. In the chat box, we have posted a link to training resources for this meeting, and also in that folder is a sign-in sheet that we ask you complete, and that link has also been added into the chat. We ask that you complete that sign-in sheet just so that we have a record of folks who were here. I know that you all have a lot of questions about PARCC remote administration, and we hope to answer as many of them as we can today. Today's webinar is meant to be an overview of the resources that are available and guidance for thinking through PARCC remote administration. With that, this link is in the chat, but it's also here on the screen, and that's the meeting resources and the sign-in sheet. A brief agenda for this afternoon's meeting. We'll give just a general overview of PARCC, some reminders about testing windows and logistics for this year. Then we'll go into considerations for preparing for remote administration and planning for it. Then the actual administration, what to do about some issues that may come up during remote testing, and then also an overview of accommodations and accessibility features and how those may be different for remote versus in-person PARCC testing. I will be pausing throughout the presentation to look at questions, so please feel free to put your questions into the chat. And if you aren't able to do that, when I pause, I'll ask folks to unmute themselves and ask any questions if they have them. So just a brief overview of PARCC administration for this school year. As you all know, PARCC will be available for both in-person and remote testing. In both of those administration modes, the test content and the delivery platform that students see will be the same. That delivery platform is TestNav, and I know that you all are used to using TestNav as an app that has to be downloaded onto a computer. But for this year, TestNav will also be available in a web browser, and that browser-based administration is what should be used for remote testing, because there are several reasons which we'll get into, but it's also requires less setup on the end of the user. And if there are students who are at home and you may not have access to those devices from school, it's easier for them to access TestNav using the browser. There will be remote testing supplements to both the test coordinator manual and test administrator manuals that provide some additional considerations and guidance for remote testing. And we have placed drafts of those supplements into the meeting resources folder for this meeting. The final ones should be posted on Pearson Access Next by the end of this week. We had an unforeseen delay there, but they will be posted by the end of this week to Pearson Access Next. Just a note about accessing the manuals versus the remote supplements. The test administrator and test coordinator manuals are posted on the DC Pearson support site, which is different than Pearson Access Next. The Pearson Access Next is one you need to log into, and that is where the remote testing supplements are. So the full manuals are on the DC Pearson support site. The remote testing supplements will be in the Pearson Access Next, where you need to log in. An overview of OSCE's definition of remote testing. Remote testing is the administration of PARCC assessments outside of a setting that is in person in a school building. So the difference between remote and in-person testing really is how students are interacting or connected to their test administrator. So for a student who's remote testing, they are virtually connected to their test administrator, whereas a student who is testing in person would actually have their test administrator in the room with them giving directions. So that being said, even if a student is in a school building, perhaps in a virtual learning hub, they may still be considered a remote tester because their test administrator would be providing direction through their computer and not necessarily in person. So there are a variety of settings we know that students may be in who may be considered remote testers. And just a note about students participating in remote testing, that they will be remotely monitored by the test administrator, and there may be additional authorized personnel who are a part of the test sessions for students who are testing remotely. Reminder about which PARCC assessments are required for this school year. Both in mathematics and ELA, students in grades 3 through 8 are required to take PARCC, and there are certain high school PARCC assessments that are required, ELA 1 and 2, which generally align to grades 9 and 10, and then Algebra 1 and Geometry are also required at high school. The statewide assessments participation policy outlines a lot more in detail about requirements for who needs to test this year, and also some additional nuance about determining whether students are remote testers or in-person testers. And that document is available on OSCE's website. Reminder of the PARCC administration windows for this year. Online testing and paper testing will both open on April 5th. The paper testing window closes a week earlier than the online. And just a reminder that paper testing is for students requiring that accommodations only. Online testing can be either remote or in person, and paper testing is available for in-person only. And a change from previous years is that schools may test at any time within the published assessment window for this school year. So in years past, schools were required to select a 30-day window within the administration window, but we wanted to give additional flexibility this year. So at any point during the published assessment administration window, schools are able to test. We just ask that your plans for administration dates are included in your school test security plans.
Stephanie?
Yes.
I put in the chat like how you're fielding questions, so I don't know if we're supposed to put them in the chat, but I have a question about this. Just for clarity, I know in the past you could not have a week between, students testing. Is that included in terms of, the virtual testing scenario right now? Can we have like a week between testing?
Yes, you can schedule test sessions at any time in the published window here between April 5th and May 28th. We know that school schedules may be different this year, and making sure that you are able to fit students in as you need. We wanted to make sure that there was flexibility to do that. So at any point during the window, you are able to create sessions and assess students.
Thank you.
Wanted to give a reminder of PARCC testing times for this year. We've communicated for several meetings about adjusting the PARCC blueprints for this year and reducing the testing time. This new unit structure reflects those changes. And so you'll see that in some cases, students are taking fewer units of the test, or that the unit testing time is reduced, or both. We've become more efficient in how we're measuring the standards. So there's the same content coverage, but there are fewer items associated with PARCC, and that's reflected here in this chart. So this reduction in the blueprint comes with a reduction in testing time, and hopefully alleviates some of the administrative burden and scheduling conflicts that we've heard about in the past. So we know that, we hope that this is welcome news, that there will be less time for testing. I just did want to note that the unit testing time here is different than administration time. Administration time includes things like time for students to get set up, times for test administrators to read directions and do assessment closeout activities. So the times you see here are the times that students should be spending actually testing, and is outside of some additional time for setup and closeout activities.
Stephanie, can I share some questions from the chat with you?
Yes, please do.
Great. One question says, if the devices kids have at home are already set up with the TestNav app, should we advise them to use it or to ignore it?
We are recommending that students who are at home are using the browser-based TestNav. If an LEA has specific questions about their unique circumstances of their students, we're happy to field those one-on-one. But in general, given how remote administration will be set up and monitored, it's better that students are using browser-based TestNav if they are at home. Were there other questions, Daniel?
I think you covered the two questions that were asked.
Okay, great. So we'll move into preparing, the section on preparing for remote administration, which includes kind of the setup tasks and things to think about as we're planning for remote administration outside of the actual administration of the test. So as a reminder, LEA coordinators are required to take OSCE's test security training. This year, we've set it up a little bit differently. Instead of folks actually coming to the OSCE office for in-person training, we have created 7 pre-recorded test security modules, and that will serve as the official test security training for LEA and non-public coordinators. And I know that a number of you actually have already completed the trainings, but those modules are available on OSCE's website, and there's a verification at the end to, it's a quiz basically, to make sure that you've gone through and understand the requirements of test security training. And that quiz a score of 80% will serve as your confirmation that you completed OSCE's test security training. Those test security training and test security guidelines that have been published cover information both for in-person and remote administration. So as you're reviewing that information and reading the guidelines, you will see specifically in the guidelines, there are blue boxes that call out new information for this year that relates to either remote administration or considerations for COVID-19. So as you're reading through the test security guidelines, just be aware that some of that new information is called out in that way. The school test security plan application that is accessed through QuickBase does include some new questions this year for remote administration. And OSCE will also be developing an exemplar school test security plan that includes some example answers and also reminders and tips to consider as you are coming up with your school test security plans. I will note that all of these resources are or will be posted onto the OSCE Test Security webpage, which is linked here. And some notes about school test security plans. We know that there is a window in which you are usually schools are submitting those plans. They're required to submit them to OSCE 15 business days before administration starts. We know there are a lot of challenges this year, and some flexibility may be required. So if you have any issues or, again, some LEA specific considerations that you'd like to ask us about, please just feel free to reach out to OSCE and we can work together on what to include in the test plan and timelines for reviewing and approving those. This slide outlines some of the roles and responsibilities of folks in your LEAs and schools who will be involved in PARCC testing. For both remote and in-person PARCC, these roles are generally the same. One difference to note is that for schools that are exclusively participating in remote administration, all of these roles can be performed successfully in a remote situation. In general, folks who are in these roles do not need to be on site at a school building. There are some exceptions. That is, if students are taking paper-based administration, that is something that can only be done in a school building on site. So in that case, there would need to be authorized personnel present at the school. One other exception, which we'll talk about a little bit later, has to do with the human reader accommodation for students who may be testing remotely. And that accommodation also requires that a test administrator be present in the school building because it involves access to a test administrator script, which is secure material, paper-based secure material. One thing I do want to note about authorized personnel, which is kind of in the lower right of this this slide, is that for the purposes of remote PARCC, folks who are at home with students, like parents or caregivers, are not considered authorized personnel. They can help students with logging in to connect with their test administrators, but it's the responsibility of those LEA and school trained test administrators, technology coordinators, to make sure that students are supported throughout test administration. So parents and caregivers are not considered authorized personnel during remote testing. This slide outlines some of the specific duties of those staff roles that were listed on the previous slide, and these are also outlined in the test coordinator manuals and test administrator manuals. But this slide just gives you a sense of the high-level responsibilities of each of the staff who may be involved with PARCC testing. I do want to note that for a change for 2021 for test administrators and proctors has to do with who may serve or who's required to serve in those roles. In past years, there was a requirement that the test administrator not be the teacher of record for students in their test session in that specific content area, or that there must be a proctor present in the testing environment. And due to, we know, staffing issues being different this year, and instructional models may necessitate folks being in different places, we have waived the requirement that that teacher of record not be the test administrator. So for this year, if a student or if a teacher is the test administrator for their own students, that is okay. which was not necessarily the case in years past. And this is also spelled out in much better language in the test security guidelines. So please do review those to get the official language with respect to test administrators and proctors and needs for those roles this year. This slide has a list of, throughout this presentation, I'll be referencing a lot of different planning resources, and this slide just kind of lists them all in one place. And in fact, at the end of this presentation, these resources are listed again with hyperlinks so that they'll take you right to where these resources exist in various locations. But I just wanted to get them all in one place in a list so that you can see all the different things that we'll be referencing. I've already talked about the coordinator manual and test administrator manuals and the remote testing supplements, but also wanted to make sure that you are aware of the accessibility and features and accommodations manual, which is also available on the DC Pearson support site, and the OSCE testing accommodations guides act as a companion to the AF&A manual. And those are available on OSCE's website, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's in those later in the presentation. The Pearson Access Next training modules, there are a lot of them, are available through Pearson Access Next, that site that you have to log into, and that's the test management platform that school and LEA test coordinators and test administrators use. And then additionally, we will have school test security plan exemplars available on the OSCE website. I do want to note that the PARCC test coordinator manual and the PARCC test administrator manual are largely written for in-person testing, because that's the default mode of administration for PARCC in general. So they have a lot more detail about tasks to complete and where to find additional information, but throughout the manuals, there are references that point you to the remote testing supplement if there are additional considerations that may be different between in-person and remote testing. And just another word about those remote testing supplements. The drafts are in the meeting resources folder for this meeting, and the final ones should be available through Pearson Access Next by the end of this week. Unlike the manuals, the remote testing supplements will not be shipped to schools. So the test coordinator and test administrator manuals, physical copies of them do get shipped to schools, but the remote testing supplements will only be available online through Pearson Access Next. The testing supplements generally follow the sequence of the test coordinator and test administrator manuals and provide considerations for tasks to be completed before testing, during testing, and after testing. And they also, specifically the test coordinator supplement, outlines both minimum requirements for remote testing as well as some best practices. So LEA and school plans need to incorporate those minimum requirements, but the best practices kind of go above and beyond what is minimally required and may be considered. Schools may want to consider them as part of their plans, but they are not baseline requirements. I'm going to pause here because I think there may be a few questions. I've not been monitoring the question chat.
Stephanie, do you want me to read them?
Yes, please.
Okay, and I might jump in on some of them too.
Sure.
And thank you for your questions, everyone. Everyone's going to have a very different, or likely, different perspective based on what's happening in your school and LEA. So the first one is a big one, some of which is covered in our test security training modules and test security guidelines, but we can address it here as well. How will it be monitored in the browser and test security? How will we ensure that they are in a secured test environment if they are remote and family are there, but they are not authorized personnel? Big question, really good question. So and I'm going to give a short answer because we address this in some of the test security trainings. We're handling test security in a different way, but in kind of a three-pronged way this year. One is in providing as clear guidance as possible. So setting up expectations for remote testing via the test security remote guidelines, providing these remote testing supplements, providing clear expectations to folks. That's one piece. Obviously, there are things that are going to happen in a remote setting potentially that you would be able to have much more control over. How you monitor during testing, which is part 2 of the kind of three-pronged approach, is there are a lot of different ways you can do that. So from our side, we will be monitoring through kind of desktop analysis, timing data, timing analysis, who's going into what session when. Some of that we're going to be providing more details around how you can go about doing that. There may be a situation where you're able to have students in breakout sessions where you're able to visually pop in. There are different ways during testing you may want to monitor based on your own analysis of your school test security plan. We also have some analysis after the fact, really important, looking at anomalous testing data and seeing if we can do data forensics analysis after. So that's kind of the third prong of how we are working on safeguarding security. That's a very, very fast response to a very complicated question. This one question that might be kind of under that question is, are LEAs and schools going to be penalized for student or parent behavior in remote environments that they can't control? And the answer is no. We will be doing analysis on validity, but LEAs and schools are expected to provide as clear guidance as possible and to monitor, but they will not be penalized by OSCE if a behavior is engaged in by a student or a family member in a remote setting. So that might not be sufficient. We can follow up after the fact, but I know it's a big question. Stefan, you could jump in on the other ones, but I wanted to tackle that one because that's particularly tricky. The second one is, does the new site program allow for a web camera or Zoom to be live?
Yes, and that's actually part of what's coming up in the presentation, considerations for how to monitor a remote test session. And you'll see it in the remote testing supplements as well. But the short answer now is that students will be connected to their test administrator through an external meeting platform, something like Zoom or Teams or whatever, generally whatever is being used for distance learning instruction would likely be the platform that students are using to be connected to their test administrator. And then they would be accessing the assessment in a separate window, in a browser window outside of that external meeting application. And that's also part of the reason why the browser-based test nav is recommended for remote administration, because that additional external meeting window does need to be open at the same time. And so having the test nav in a browser as opposed to the app facilitates the ability to have those two screens open, or two programs open.
Great. Next question. Is there a timer within the test platform that will automatically shut down the test after the allotted test time has been reached for remote testers?
No, there is not a timer. It's the test administrator will be connected to their students through their external meeting platform, and it's the test administrator's responsibility to keep time in terms of allotted testing time and provide reminders to students of when they are approaching the end of that time. And once that time has been reached, the test administrator should be locking the unit so that students aren't able to log back in, which we'll also talk a little bit about later in this presentation.
And that's where also desktop monitoring of kind of when students are logging in and logging out will be critical, something we can also look at on our end. Next question, can students be tested in small groups online with students in breakout rooms?
Yes, is the short answer there. And this is also something that is written out in more detail in the remote testing supplement, some of the considerations for remote testing, because students will be connected to their test administrator through a meeting platform. There are several things that configurations that can be done to facilitate the administration, and breaking students out into individual rooms or small groups of rooms with small groups of students may be a way that your school or LEA determines is the best way to administer the assessment for your students. And that's something that there's some guidance and considerations in the remote testing supplements for what schools may choose to do. But again, we wanted to make sure that the guidance is flexible enough that schools and LEAs are able to determine what works best for them within kind of the framework that we've provided.
Great. It looks like there are 3 additional questions, and then we'll pause after the 3, and then we'll let you go continue, and then we'll stop for some more questions. So the next question is, are we able to share the test via a shared screen in Zoom, or do students need to log in separately?
Okay, so students will be logging in to a Zoom or Teams or meeting with their test administrator. In terms of sharing screens, students should not be screen sharing active test content with their test administrators or with anyone. It's one of the fundamental, one of the tenets of our test security is that the content remains as secure as possible. Test administrators may find it valuable to share their screens with students to provide things like timing reminders and have like a note up on their screen saying you have 10 minutes left or something to that effect. But students should not be sharing their screens at all with their test administrators or with anyone. There are a couple of exceptions to that having to do with accommodations, and those are described in more detail in the testing accommodations guides. And we'll touch on those also later in this presentation.
And you want to think of structurally that is very similar to in-person, and apologies for my little one in the background, but that an individual student will sign into their test, their individual test, that is their test and no other student's test. And that is separate from the kind of Teams introduction or facilitation by the test administrator. So they have their browser where they are taking their test independently. So the next question, we talked about this a little bit separately, and Kiriyoung, we might need some follow-up questions offline about this. But the question is, if any student is in partial in-person learning and partial virtual learning for the same subject, can they test remotely even if they are physically at school on the day of the test? And Stephanie, let me know if you want me to jump in.
Yeah, I think that the short answer is likely yes. I think we'd probably want to have additional follow-up conversations to think through some of the nuances. We are aware that even within a school, there may be several instructional models happening at the same time that aren't fully accounted for in the guidance that we provided, and we want to make sure that we are being thoughtful partners with you and helping you think through what some scenarios may be for particular students or groups of students. And we're more than happy to do that and provide that technical assistance in office hours or setting up separate calls.
Great. And the last question before we pause is, and I'll take this one, what's the participation rate requirement for this year? So many of you have seen the participation and performance policy document that we released earlier that is posted online and we sent via email. And that highlights the requirements for participation. The federal requirement for 95% participation hasn't changed. That being said, we acknowledge the challenges and that you may face in getting to that 95%. So we are just encouraging schools and LEAs to try their best to ensure that the widest number of students possible are tested. The kind of requirements around participation rate have not changed, but we are continuing to talk with leadership about what this means moving forward. So Stephanie, there are 4 more questions in the chat. We said we'd pause. Let me know when there's another moment to address the 4 remaining questions.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do is keep going with the content because there's still a lot more to get through, and definitely am available to answer additional questions throughout this presentation and also later on through follow-ups, but just want to make sure that we get through the main content and are able to hopefully answer some of your questions as we move along. So we are actually still in the section about thinking about preparing for administration, and just wanted to share information about technology requirements for TestNav and system requirements. The link here links to hardware and software requirements for devices to be used for testing. One thing I do want to note is that the Pearson page notes that there are certain versions of browsers and systems that are supported, but we've had DC specific conversations with Pearson, and they will be providing support for systems, particularly for Chrome, OS 72 and newer. I think that on their actual site, it says that it supports Chrome 80 something and above, but we've asked them to include support for those older devices in case those devices aren't able to be updated. So they will be supporting Chrome 72 and newer. That is just for this school year administration. And just another note about making sure that technology is ready. You, if you choose, you may run an infrastructure trial for your either your LEA or individual schools, and those are run through the Pearson Access Next training site, which is different than the Pearson Access Next live site. The training site is like the colors in it are brown as opposed to blue, just so that you can distinguish between the two. But the training site is where you can kind of play around with things and practice running an infrastructure trial, practice doing registrations and things without putting them into the live site. An infrastructure trial is recommended to make sure that you are able to, and you and students are able to access the tests and navigate through them, and infrastructure trials can be a way to identify any issues that there may be up front before actual test administration starts. We are currently updating the infrastructure trial guide that is available on Pearson Access Next with some additional considerations for conducting a remote infrastructure trial. And that should also be up by the end of this week. Some notes about staff preparation for remote testing. Another note that all staff involved in testing must receive test security training from the LEA or the school test coordinator. And this will include training on any of your school-specific administration procedures. I think what you'll see in the remote testing supplements is there are some mentions of schools developing school-specific protocols, and that is because we know that OSCE can't develop a solution that works for 100% of scenarios, 100% of schools. And so there is some flexibility built in within certain parameters. And that flexibility is where you want to make sure that your school test coordinators and test administrators understand your LEA's requirements and their school requirements and those particular procedures for their school. So that's where it's really important to make sure that that training is happening for school level staff. A note about responsibilities of test coordinators, test administrators, and other authorized personnel. Those responsibilities were listed on a few slides ago, but they're also detailed in the test coordinator manual, test administrator manual, and there's some additional considerations in the remote supplements. And a note about administering accommodations. There is some guidance in the remote testing supplements and in the manuals. There's also guidance in the OSCE testing accommodations guides for remote administration of certain accommodations. And just to note that any test administrators responsible for administering those accommodations should be trained to do so. Also, before testing, thinking about preparing families and students to take PARCC remotely. There is not currently, but there will be sample parent notification letters on OSSE's website. Our communications team is working on some additional resources to help families and students prepare for remote testing and some considerations for best practices of a remote testing environment. Also, before testing, outside of notifying parents, is making sure that students are comfortable with the tools and items that will be in the assessments. There are practice tests and tutorials available, allowing students who will be using accommodations to practice with those, especially if the way that those are delivered may look a little different this year than in years past. And then also ensuring that you are reviewing those school-specific procedures with your students, how they're going to log into the test, who they have to talk to or contact if they have issues while they're testing, and how. And then also thinking about destroying secure test materials like used scratch paper after each test unit.
Stephanie, is the recommendation, yes, is there a recommendation on how students should destroy in their house other than like putting into the trash? Is there a...
Yeah, they're in the remote testing supplement for test coordinators. There's there's an example script of what a test administrator might say to guide students through destroying their used scratch paper and other secure materials. I think that Danielle may mention before, like, somebody asked, are schools responsible for what happens in a student's home? And largely no. We do want you to do your best to make sure that security is being maintained to the best of your ability, knowing that your ability only extends so far when we're talking about what happens in a student's home. So there's a example script of what could be said to facilitate the destruction of used scratch paper, but also schools are welcome to develop their own procedures and include them in their school test security plan. And we can also provide additional one-on-one support if schools would like to think of a different way to accomplish that. Some notes about remote test session requirements, and I think we've touched on some of this, but students who are testing remotely, just like students in person, need to be placed in test sessions through Pearson Access Next. The SRP&P this year does include a new field that indicates whether a student is testing in person or remotely, and that field is required. Currently, it, I think, defaults to everyone. It defaults to remote, but if students are testing in person, schools should be updating that field, and that field can be updated past the initial upload, but we just want to make sure that schools are completing that field as accurately as possible. And the naming convention for test sessions for this year also includes a convention to indicate whether students are testing, whether a session is a remote session or an in-person session. And more details about that are in the test coordinator manual and the field definitions guide for the SRP&P. As we mentioned before, the expectation is that test administrators who are remote administrators are connected to their students using an external meeting app, whether it's Teams, Zoom, Google Meet, generally whatever is being used for distance learning instruction. There are some minimum requirements of that app in that it must support audio and chat. Enabling student video is recommended, but optional. We know that there can be sensitivities around students being on camera and we fully want to respect that. So if students are comfortable having their cameras on, it would be recommended, but know that that's not a requirement. And then, as mentioned before, students that would connect to TestNav using a supported web browser after they've been connected with their test administrator. As I mentioned before, the school test security plan for this year does include some new questions specific to remote administration. In general, LEAs will set general policies and requirements for their schools, and schools can add specific details about their specific plans and roles that their personnel will be playing in remote administration. The school test security plans have to include the information that you see here, but may include additional information outside of this, as much detail as schools would like to provide. And again, we at OSSI are available to talk with folks about what makes sense, review plans or specific procedures that you're considering implementing, so that you can ensure that your plans will be approved through the approval process. School-specific scripts for those procedures do need to be included and approved in those test security plans. So if there is language that you would like to run by OSSI first, we're happy to look at that before the official submission of the plan. Okay, this is the end of the preparing section, so I'm going to pause here for additional questions. Danielle?
There are a number in the chat, and thank you, Dominique, for chiming in and answering some of the questions. I appreciate it. Feel free others to jump in where you need to. That's appreciated. Trying to scroll up to the top, there were a number of questions about students signing in on time and signing out on time. And this was answered in the chat, but I want to reinforce that that's correct, that you do have the opportunity as a test administrator to lock and unlock units. So you have that opportunity to kind of shut it down and start on time. So that's something that you have the opportunity to do within PAN. To the question of the accommodations scribe, that is something that was covered in the accommodations webinar. So we might want to wait till the end and we can talk offline if people are interested in talking about specific TA recommendations or guidance for the scribe accommodation, which it can be done, of course, in person, but does have a remote option as well. And it's unique to remote testing. The questions about infrastructure trials, that was sort of answered, I think, but if someone wants to jump in, a question about whether or not it's possible for LEAs to get a sample student login so you can test out with your infrastructure trial. Is it exactly the same as a student's live experience? And you can set up your PAN training site to mimic the live site. Going down the list. First question we want to discuss. Can you talk about chain of custody, sign out, sign in of materials, if that is needed this year, if you are doing full remote administration?
Sure, yeah, and the materials that will be transmitted for if there's complete remote administration are minimal. Like there wouldn't be paper going back and forth. There is a consideration for testing ticket information that does get shared between different parties, and there is some guidance in the remote testing supplements about thinking how to securely destroy that, but at this time we are still thinking through what, if any, chain of custody documentation we would ask that LEAs complete for complete remote administration. So more to come on that.
There are a couple questions I'm going to chunk into two categories. One is about updating your plans if situations change, which we imagine they may and will. So one is, how late can the field of in-person or remote be updated, presumably in the SRPNP? And the second question is, if you're 100% virtual, are you expected to adjust your testing plans if the LEA decides to go back to a hybrid model prior to PARCC? Would you have to test in person or could you still test remotely?
So I think that, and Danielle, you can feel free to jump in on this too. If a school is 100% virtual and then moves to some in-person or hybrid, I think it would be up to the school to decide whether you would want to adjust your testing plans. We certainly think that in-person administration may be something that schools are more, it is definitely something that schools are more used to doing, and if they're more comfortable doing that, that is up to schools to and LEAs to decide, as long as their school test plan reflects the reality of what will be implemented. I think changing your plan very quickly from remote to completely in person could be a challenge, but those kinds of changes we can talk through separately in technical assistance or support with specific LEAs if that's something that you think may happen.
I'd echo that, Stephanie. And I'd say that to the point of the field being updated, it can be updated throughout. You would need to update your stool test security plan so that we are aware. We're going to be noting that a number of plans may be updated and changed more rapidly than we'd be used to. We are prepared for that. We're ready to look at that. And as Stephanie stated, if you're concerned and you're not sure, just reach out to us. We'll have a technical support call with you. We'll help you walk it through and figure it out. We would recommend that if you're able to test in person and if that works for your school, to do it that way because it's a known entity for educators and for students. If that is not tenable, of course, if you're in the hybrid or remote setting, you're able to do it remotely, of course. So we are able to be flexible with you. There are a couple questions about devices. So 2 questions. Will this work on an iPad or do students need to be on a laptop or desktop computer? And then from another person, will this work on a cell phone? So tech device questions.
So the answer to the iPad question is yes, the test should work on an iPad as long as the student is able to be connected simultaneously to the meeting application with their test administrator and have a browser open. Cell phones, I am not sure that those would meet the specifications needed, the technical specifications needed for running TestNav. That's something I can take back. It certainly wouldn't be recommended for cell phones just for screen size issues, but I will double check with Pearson about what is technically possible and feasible.
Yeah, we can follow up with those guidelines. I'm pretty positive it does not meet the guidelines, particularly on math for screen scrolling size and display size. But we'll share those guidelines with you all. Another question, we'll take a couple more and then we'll pause again. Is the external meeting application required for testing? We've had situations where students have lost access to Zoom during testing, but still were able to test. If a student loses Zoom during testing, can we monitor them non-visually?
So the connection to their test administrator using the external meeting app is a requirement. We understand technical issues do pop up occasionally, but it's our expectation that students are connected through the external meeting app to their test administrator. That being said, if a student is still testing and connected to the Pearson, to the TestNav test session, their progress can be monitored by their test administrator through the Pearson Access Next dashboard. So while the administrator would still be able to tell that the student is progressing through the test, the requirement is that the student be connected through the meeting app as well as they're taking the assessment. We can also talk offline about issues that may happen in terms of students getting disconnected and any specific scenarios that you want to ask about or talk to.
And we would have, noting that as an incident, and OSSI would respond back of how to triangulate any specific issues around that, much like tech disturbances you might have in person. Dominique, I saw your hand was raised, but now it's not raised. Is it still raised?
Oh, I was actually just going to ask about that. I know in the past it's sort of been like, if you can get them back online within a couple minutes, no need to recorded as an incident. But I guess I'm also just trying to think through, like, if we only have 60 minutes and a kid loses, like the external app, does that invalidate the test? Like, that's what was trying to get at. Like,
Yeah.
what we tell our TAs to do in that moment, obviously try to get them back on Zoom, but if they're also testing and it's, there's a time limit, what does that look like in that moment?
Yep. So I would say, we've talked about this, and our similar guidance has been that if it's a couple minutes, like you would in a school setting, you'd mark it as a minor deviation, you'd move on, you'd keep going. If there was a large scale disruption to the student, you put it as an incident report, and we'd figure out how to get the student retested. But we'll put that in our FAQ and with an actual written response to that question. I think that's really important.
Great, thank you.
Okay, Stephanie, can we do a couple more questions, or do you want to?
Yeah, let's do just a couple more. I do want to keep moving though.
Okay. Two quick things that were asked, and I'll answer this quick question about, will you have access to the meeting recording? Yes, we will also share the accommodations webinar information with you all. Look out for that posted online, and we'll share it in the NGA bulletin. So the last question we'll take before we move on. I'll ask one question I'll also raise is safety should be first, though. So shouldn't we do remote? I want to raise this because I think we try to say this first and foremost in all of our guidance. Safety, health, and safety is critical and the first consideration for everyone. We are not in each school in LEA, so it's really difficult to make wide sweeping statements on what is safe and appropriate. So that is why we've provided as much flexibility as we can as to administration setting. If it is, you believe it is, safe, you are open for business, you are able to test in person, do that. If you are not able to do that, that's why we've gone through all of this to try to make remote testing as high quality as possible. So that is within your purview. That's why we're creating this flexibility as to when you should test remotely or in person. But the last question I will say before we pause is, what's the recommended way for students to distribute login credentials for students in remote testing supplement? So what is the recommended way you distribute the secure testing materials? And that might be in the next section.
Yeah, and I think that there is some guidance in the remote testing supplements, but that will largely depend on what works best for individual schools and maybe dependent on what meeting platform is being used. I will say that email is not a secure method of transmission, but things like message systems within a learning management system, like if you are able to message students or teachers through SharePoint or Canvas, those would be acceptable, but they just can't be emailed. And another method that's mentioned in the testing supplements is putting them in individual chats within the meeting app as well, is something that could be a way to distribute that information to students. And one other question that I saw going through, just wanted to address, is where are the remote testing supplements? There are drafts posted in the meeting resources folder that are near final draft, but the full final remote testing supplements will be posted to Pearson Access Next by the end of this week. I'm going to keep going and hopefully we'll be able to pause for questions again, but I just want to make sure that we do get through the content, and hopefully we'll go a little bit faster and maybe have answered some of the questions or addressed some of these things already. And I think that there were a couple of questions that touched on the remote testing environment and what's expected there. We advise that students and caregivers make their remote testing space as secure and distraction-free as possible. We know that there are variations in students' ability to do that, but to the extent possible, having students in a quiet and secluded place to test is obviously ideal. ensuring that students have all of the materials they need for testing ready to use before they actually start. So do they have headphones if they need them? Do they have scratch paper and pencils ready before you actually start the test session? A word on prohibited material, and prohibited materials are covered in several of our documents, the test security guidelines, the test security training modules about what can and cannot be present in the testing environment. And I just will note that in general, electronics should not be in the testing environment. There are a couple of exceptions that are noted if students need electronics for an accommodation, or if students need to contact their test administrator and the meeting platform is unavailable. In that case, they may be able to use a cell phone in order to do that. But in general, electronics should not be present other than the testing device. In an in-school setting, things like wall displays and things that include tested content or information that relates to the tested content area need to be removed or covered. To the extent possible, we ask that LEAs and schools do their best to educate students and caregivers on what should and should not be present in a testing environment and provide guidance of acceptable and non-acceptable behavior in a remote testing environment. But I will reiterate that we are not holding LEAs and schools accountable for what happens in a remote testing setting in a student's home. So we would like to ask you to do what you can to the best of your ability, knowing that you are not able to control everything. And this is something that we've also touched on already, so I'll go pretty quickly through this, but in terms of actually beginning a remote testing session, test administrators, and if you are using proctors, they would also be connected to students using their external meeting application. Parents and caregivers who are at home with kids can assist them with logging into that application, but the actual steps of getting set up, directing them to the TestNav site, and logging in are things that the test administrator should be directing the students to do. After a student has gotten connected to their test administrator, parents and caregivers do not have an active role in the testing environment. Administration scripts for the test administrators are in the test administrator manual. There are boxes within that manual that have scripts for what the test administrators are to say. There have been some adjustments in those scripts, or in the language around the scripts, about what to say or not say for remote administration. There are some things that work a little bit differently in terms of what test administrators may be directing students to do remotely versus an in-person setting. And a note about scripts is that clarification of some school-specific procedures may be necessary as test administrators are going through the script and directing students on giving them the test directions. So schools and LEAs are able to create that school-specific language about their procedures or reminders and include those in their test security plan for OSCE approval before testing. And just a note about consideration that I think came up earlier is that putting students in individual breakout rooms to minimize disruption while they're testing is something that may be considered. If that's a function that's supported by your meeting application. It's not required, but could be a good way to ensure that students are able to remain focused. In terms of monitoring, I think we talked a little bit about this too, but active proctoring in a remote setting will look different than it does in an in-person setting. And again, the language of "to the best of your ability" is what we're asking test administrators to do in terms of monitoring. There are dashboards built into Pearson Access Next that will allow test administrators to monitor their student progress. The test administrator may be monitoring the session chat if for students have questions or any technology issues. And then they may also considering if students are in individual breakout rooms, they may consider circulating to those rooms to ensure that students are remaining on task. In terms of communicating with students during testing, it is I don't want to say required, but to the extent possible, the external meeting application needs to remain active throughout the test session so that students can contact the test administrator or the proctor if they do have issues. If that application is unavailable for some reason, a student or caregiver may use the cell phone to communicate with the TA or the proctor or a technology coordinator. And those specific protocols of who do I contact if something goes wrong are things that should be shared with students and families before testing. Students are not to screen share an active testing window if they're having an issue with an item or a functionality. They are not to share their screen with anyone. That goes back to test security. There are exceptions for certain accommodations. And just a note about test administrators, they're not able to answer any content-related questions during testing or functionality-related questions of like, how does this item type work in TestNav? Those are things that are able to be covered with practice tests and tutorials before testing so that students are comfortable with the platform and with the test item, how test items appear before they're actually in an active testing session. I'm going to keep going and then we'll pause for questions after this section. Just wanted to talk through some of the issues that may come up during remote testing. I know that technology issues are top of mind for a lot of folks, but just wanted to first recap procedures for reporting testing issues and testing irregularities that occur during test sessions. This applies both to in-person and to remote sessions. Any major issues should be documented and included in a test incident report to OSCE. Additional information about how to report those incidents is at the link that's shown there. One thing to note about testing incidents and test irregularities, we know that LEAs and schools may not be able to be aware of everything that's happening in a remote testing environment, particularly if it's at a student's home. And we just ask that in incident reports, what you are able to report that you do, so that we have an understanding of what's happening during administration. I think it may have been touched on, but folks have asked like what happens if a student gets disconnected, but then it only lasts a few minutes, things like that. For this spring, there's a new auto resume function that will allow students to log back into their test session without a test administrator needing to intervene. So if a student does get temporarily disconnected, but then is able to get back on in a minute, they can put in their login information again and get reconnected to their session without having to be resumed by their test administrator. So that may cut down on traffic needing to be escalated to test administrator or test coordinator to fix issues that happen with small technology blips. Just a note that if the test session has been locked by the test administrator or test coordinator, then a student would not be able to log back in and they would need intervention from an authorized personnel to be able to resume their test session. And just a note that test sessions should be locked at the end of the unit testing time so that the students cannot log back in after that allotted time. And this slide just provides a flowchart of how auto resume works. This is also in the remote testing supplement and maybe in the manual as well. I don't recall at this time, but just shows the process for students being able to log back into TestNav if there's an interruption before they submit their test. Okay, this is the final section, so I'm going to go through this and then we can have the rest of the time to answer any additional questions that may have come in. Accommodations and accessibility features for remote testers. This was also largely covered in the PARCC Accommodations webinar that was held last week, maybe, and that recording should be available on the OSSI website very soon, maybe today, but if not, it will definitely be up in the next couple of days, just so that you're able to access that recording and those slides. The information here covers a lot of the same information, but there's definitely more details available in that accommodations webinar presentation. Just in general, assigning accommodations and accessibility features for assessment is the responsibility of the LEA and schools to make sure that students are receiving the accommodations that they're entitled to as detailed in their IEP, 504, or EL plan. Accommodations that students are using for assessment should generally be consistent with what they're using in instruction, and particularly remote accommodations should be consistent with remote accommodations for distance learning. So schools, LEAs may have developed a particular way to deliver an accommodation to a student during distance learning. And if that works, we would encourage that same method of delivery to be used for assessment, if possible, just so that there's that consistency for the student. But we have developed some guidance on how certain accommodations may be delivered. But again, if an LEA has an alternate way that has been working for them throughout the year, we would definitely want to have a conversation to see if that's something that's possible for assessment. Just to note that the vast majority of accommodations and accessibility features are embedded in the assessment platform. So the conversation about how to deliver remote accommodations is pretty limited to certain accommodations that we'll be talking about in a minute. Paper-based accommodations like Braille and large print and any of the paper-based tests must be administered in person only because secure paper materials cannot leave school buildings. Something that is detailed in the testing accommodations guide is that if there are schools that are open and serving students in any capacity, whether it's hybrid or in-person instruction, are required to provide the opportunity for students who need to use paper-based tests to test in person. Those students or families may decline sending their students in to take those paper-based accommodations, but the opportunity does need to be made available if they if schools are open and serving students in any way. As I mentioned, most of the accessibility features and accommodations are embedded in the TestNav online platform, but there are a few that are human delivered, like human reader, human scribe, or signer. Those in general may be used via remote administration, and the way in which it's executed during remote administration may look different than in person, but reasonable effort should be made to make sure that there's consistency and that students are receiving the accommodations that they're entitled to. I will note that the human reader accommodation for math there is a partial solution for remote testing in that the student who is testing may be remote. The students who are receiving that accommodation can be remote, but the test administrator would need to be in a school building because that human reader for math accommodation uses a paper-based script, and that paper script cannot leave the school building. So while a student receiving the accommodation may be remote, the test administrator would need to be in a school building. There are alternative ways to provide a accommodation, not human reader for math, but text to speech. That may be a consideration for students who are using that accommodation if access to the building is not available. That would likely require an IEP amendment, but it's a consideration that may be something that, if it's determined to be appropriate for that student, may be a good alternative to human reader for math. But that's an individual student level decision. As I mentioned, the testing accommodations guide are available. They're on, there's link is in one of the slides in this deck, but they've been updated with some guidance for administering remote accommodations and accessibility features. And again, if LEAs have specific protocols that they've already developed that they want to use for assessments, please just reach out to us and we can have a conversation. This table is an excerpt from one of the testing accommodations guides just to orient you to where we've added that remote administration guidance. So the first two columns just show how the accommodation or accessibility feature is listed in SEDS, what human administered accommodation for PARCC exists, how that's identified for PARCC, and then guidance on how you may consider administering that accommodation for remote administration. And this is just an excerpt. There are many more. This is just part of a larger chart in those documents. Okay, I made it to the end. Thank you all for, I'm sure there are a ton of questions that I'm missing in the chat right now, but we have the next 11 minutes to just answer questions. I will note that there are a few more slides in this deck that just have information about links to the resources that we've talked about and folks' points of contact at OSSI for any questions that you may have specific to these different areas and topics. But at this time, Danielle, can you go back to questions?
I can. So I want to say to everyone first, there are a lot of really important and thoughtful questions in this chat, and we will not be able to get to all of them, but we will make sure everyone's question is answered. So we will follow up with you individually. We will try to share as much recap at the NGA meeting as possible. We'll also offer another opportunity to ask remote questions at the NGA meeting. Also, if you want to schedule a call with us or you want to ask questions via email, please do. We've been having a lot of one-on-one LEA problem solving conversations, and we are happy to do that. I extend that olive branch because we want to be partners with you in this work. So that's my disclaimer. So I am scrolling back to the top from where we stopped. There are so many questions, which is great. Okay, so it looks like the first question that I'm seeing is about multiple devices. Can you use multiple devices during testing? For example, can you be on Zoom on your phone, but testing on a Chromebook?
That's an interesting consideration. My initial reaction is to step back and think about it some more to be able to provide you with a more thoughtful answer. But I think that's another one of those issues that we can certainly include in our FAQ about best practices for devices. But I don't want to just answer off the cuff, so I want to take some time to think about that one.
Yep, there are a number of tech questions that we can condense together. So I'll answer the next one, but the next one was there any progress on identifying places in the city where students could participate in testing, like they do professional exams? We are still exploring that, Dominique, and we'll get to that. We'll follow back with you if we make any progress on that. The next, though I know some people are doing virtual learning hubs or care classrooms, and those types of opportunities are really important. And that hits on the next question that I think is really important and that we have been thinking a lot about, which is I wonder how we're able to support different scholars, support scholars who may need a different testing environment, such as our homeless scholars. Are these types of inequities our scholars face taken into consideration in these decisions? We are absolutely have been talking a lot about ways to support all of our students, and that is of the utmost importance to us. And I think it's really critical that we probably reflect on making sure our communications reflect that. One thing I would ask is something we've been thinking about is the way in which to really try to mirror the way in which you've been providing distance learning opportunities for those students. And so if you've been in a virtual learning hub, or you've had a care classroom, or you've had something of that nature for your distance learning, you want to try to make it as consistent and streamlined as possible for those students. If you are finding a specific challenge that have not been addressed through distance learning, let's talk about it separately, but that is critically important that we're thinking about the realities our students are facing, and we want to help you with that. A couple questions around test security. Can we ask TAs to record their sessions for quality purposes to ensure they're not supporting students if we can't be in and around at all times? If no questions or secure content is being shown, would that be okay?
I would defer to LEA and school policies on recording sessions. I know that some parents may not want their students to be involved in recorded sessions, so that may be a school by school decision. I would say that if there's nothing in your school or LEA policies preventing recording, that's something that you could implement if you would like to do that.
Yep, and that would be so as long as an accommodation is not being screen shared, for that purpose, no secure content. If it was permissible by your LEA, certainly. Another recommendation we did have that you could choose to do is saving chat logs and have it be a part of your school to security plan. So that's another thing if you're not going to record the full session, though if you can do that, it's available, absolutely go forth and do that. But chat logs may be another option. I'll answer Jess's question. Could schools additionally use something like GoGuardian to monitor student activity during testing to ensure they're not also on social media, Wikipedia, etc.? That's a really good question. We'll include that in our tech follow-up because I want to check with Pearson on just the way GoGuardian may interact with their site. So we'll check in on that one. Note that Pearson also does social media monitoring broadly for content, right, for any content breaches. So that would be an addition, and we will check in on that. Next question is, can individual schools enable or disable the auto resume function? And add on to that, does auto resume work if the system doesn't show the student is exited?
So to address the first part, no. Auto resume is something that's enabled by Pearson at the state level, essentially. So it is enabled for all sessions and is not something that can be enabled or disabled by individual LEAs or schools. The second part was, does auto resume work if the student is not shown it's exited? That is a question that I will follow up with Pearson on. I believe the answer, actually, I don't know. I will follow up with Pearson about the intricacies of auto resume because I don't want to give you the wrong information.
There's another question about non-publics and registration and whether or not they're responsible for checking off accommodations from IEPs in PAN. If you are not responsible, check with your LEA of record, but the accommodations for IEPs and students who are English learners are to be included in PAN. They are required to be put in there. So, I believe most of our non-publics do put them in, but check with your LEA of record on if there's a difference in the responsibility there. Victoria has a question about cell phones. So previously, students who were caught with cell phones during an active test session were asked to immediately log out, not permitted to continue that unit, and an incident report was still submitted. Is that still the process if a student's seen with a cell phone? So that's going to depend on your plan for your school security plan. It is our hope that students will not need to use cell phones for this function. So for the vast majority of students, again, forgive my child who's also very invested in this conversation. for the vast majority of students, you will be using a device that is not a cell phone, and you will likely be using a learning management system, and that's the way you're communicating with kids. So in that setting, if your school test security plan does not list a cell phone as an object that a student can use to connect with a teacher, then if you see a cell phone, it's an incident, and you see it, put it in there, right? That's helpful to us. If there is an extreme circumstance where a cell phone is needed to connect with a test administrator for technology issues, then you put that in your school test security plan. And then if it is noted, you would not put it as an incident if you see it for that purpose. So it depends on your school test security plan, but we are hoping that cell phones are a last resort option if you don't have another option. And we also would see that and approve that in your plan. Can we individually lock students' test sessions? I think we answered that above, that yes, you have the opportunity to lock and unlock sessions. How do we test students that require paper-based accommodations? The student declines to send the student in. If the student declines to send the student in for paper-based testing, then they are not tested. What kind of documentation is required if parents decide to not send students with paper-based accommodations for testing? Will this affect participation rates? We've been talking with our K-12 and our legal team about the required accommodations and what that looks like. We will handle the back end of that in data validation. So we'll follow up in the data validation process, but we can provide some language to you offline because it'll take more than 3 minutes to talk about. Will they be delivered to the test admin or to the STC's home address? I'm not sure, LaShonda, what that question is related to. My apologies. If it's about secure materials, no secure materials will be shipped to anyone's home. Secure materials are only shipped to school buildings for security purposes. A good question. We were looking at the SRPMP and we did not see the space for human scribe. Steph, do you want to take the SRPMP question?
Yeah, I will follow up with Pearson. That should not be the case. There should be a space to indicate human scribe. If it's missing, that's something we'll need to update.
And let's do one more question, and then the rest we'll absolutely follow up on. I wish we had time to answer all of your questions. And we will answer them after the meeting. For the requirement to provide the opportunity for students using paper-based accommodations, are there protocols we should follow? Oh, so that's similar. I apologize. That's a similar question. We will follow up on that after the meeting. There was an Ann's question about the electronic script for human reader. There is an electronic script login, for ELA, and there was an answer to this that math has a specific script because of the way you need to describe graphs, equations, and that is a secure material that needs to go to a school building. So I know we're at 1 more minute and there's still a number of questions. Stephanie, do you want to kind of do a quick closeout, and we will make sure to follow up with folks?
Sorry to get off mute. Yes, I just want to thank you all again for your participation and all of your really great questions for this session. I know that remote administration is something new, and we're working together with you to figure out how we can make it the most successful possible in the district for this spring. Please, as we've said several times, do not hesitate to reach out to us as you continue in your planning. We are your partners here. We want to make sure that we're doing whatever we can for you, to support you and make sure that you have everything that you need to have a successful administration this spring. This recording will be posted along with the slides to OSSE's website in the next couple of days. But again, please, at any time, reach out, email, call us, and we're happy to provide additional support and guidance. Thank you, everyone.